So this past weekend was some of the most nauseating sports media coverage we've ever seen. And that was all centered around, of course, you guessed it, Shedeur Sanders and the whole draft, NFL draft of 2025. The big story for everyone going in was where was Shedeur Sanders going to get drafted? All the hype behind that, the media coverage, the pomp and circumstance behind Deion Sanders and all that kind of stuff. And, I'll admit it was super surprising when he sort of fell out of those first 20 picks. I remember watching thinking, all right, 21st pick or whatever it was, here comes the Steelers, probably going to get him. Nope. And then when that happened, dropped out the first day, second day, is like, wow, what's going on here? But it wasn't actually, I guess, all that surprising from the perspective of, I guess, the sports teams, who, if you hear the stories that came out about Shedeur Sanders, about how he was just super arrogant in the draft process in terms of the interviews, acting all brash, overconfident in terms of not really respecting the process and all that. A lot of that I blame on Deion Sanders in terms of he gets that whole sort of bravado from him. And Shedeur Sanders, I mean, obviously he can play, put up some good numbers at Colorado, but he ain't Deion Sanders in terms of prospect. Where sports has always shown that, the higher your talent, the more teams are going to tolerate. And Shedeur Sanders, he's got that whole kind of, media coverage and spectacle about him. But I don't think he really doesn't obviously have that talent of a Deion Sanders. But whatever, the slide happens, and of course, it really reveals the sort of the idiots and the people that do have common sense in sports media. In terms of you have one side of people, Shedeur ends up getting drafted fifth round, 144th pick. And you have the reaction from some people that call it, racist, all this fucking bullshit and all that. And then you have the other half that says, well, there's a reason that this happened. And this is because of all the stuff that I mentioned about in terms of how he was, just how he kind of didn't really respect the draft process, all of that kind of stuff, the media circus that goes around him, all that. And you can guess what side of the fence I'm on this one. And that's in terms of, look, I do think that Shadeur's talent, I think it was surprising that he wasn't one of the, top three quarterbacks drafted. I mean, it was pretty much a done deal that Cam Ward was going to go number one, but I would have figured if a team needed Shedeur as a quarterback, he'd be one of the top three quarterbacks drafted. But I think a lot of it goes into what we heard about afterwards in terms of how, Shedeur was just not really respecting the process in terms of how he interviewed, just in how he presented himself. And the thing is, it was that once it became apparent that, the teams that you thought might have selected him, like the Steelers, Saints, teams that might have needed a quarterback but decided to pass for whatever the reasons, some of the reasons that I mentioned, it gets to the point where, okay, you draft him, it's going to be a backup quarterback. And I've always heard this, and you hear this in media coverage a lot of times when it comes to NFL. When you have a backup quarterback, you don't want no celebrity backup quarterback. You don't want cameras following your backup and all the media circus in terms of people asking, is this one's the dude going to play? When's he going to play? When's he going to play? That just gets exhausting for the coach, the team, everything. And nobody wants that kind of stuff to deal with. So I think once it got to that point, a lot of the teams just decided to pass over it. And one of the things that's really stupid that people say, especially something I heard with Stephen A. Smith say in terms of, oh, 32 teams passed over Shedeur. 32 teams did not need a quarterback. There was only maybe about five teams that you could look at that needed a quarterback. The teams that didn't need one are the ones that obviously have their superstar starters, like the Chiefs, the Bills, the Ravens, the who else, the Bengals, teams like that, the Eagles. And then of course you have your teams that they just drafted a quarterback, obviously a team like the Bears and teams with their rookie quarterbacks that they just drafted, they ain't gonna draft Shedeur. So the process was really down to about like five teams. Five teams, those kind of teams we're talking about that need a quarterback, like the Browns, the Saints, the Giants, all that. And let's not forget, and this has kind of gotten forgotten some bit, but over the past few months or a few months ago, we heard Deion Sanders say that, "Oh, I'm not gonna let my son go to certain teams. Certain teams we're going to avoid." Well, you have your father flat out saying that. I think that kind of goes into how a team would say, you know what, I'm not trying to deal with all this bullshit. So that's the reason for the slide, I think. I think some of the tape kind of showed that, all right, maybe this guy isn't really the prospect that the media sort of hyped him up to be. And it was the media is to blame on a lot of this kind of stuff. to where I think because of the relationship that, Deion Sanders has with the media in terms of all the circus that was around Colorado for the last few years, and obviously playing with Travis Hunter, who won the Heisman for the past season, all the hype that goes behind Colorado football. I mean, it was a pretty big spectacle the last few years. It make you think that Shedeur was going to be like a top five pick or something like that. But I think the combination of the hype just being too much, and plus a lot of the stuff that just didn't really go too well in terms of the interview process. There were stories about how he bombed the interview with the Giants. Teams will draft a quarterback, and they don't if they really need it, and they don't care about that kind of circus. Like I said, your talent kind of or sort of goes above whatever kind of circus you get. And that means in terms of if you're a top prospect or whatever kind of athlete you are, teams don't care about, what kind of baggage you got, if you want to call it baggage that he has. And, like I said, he ain't to blame. He's not blameless in any of this stuff also. You look at the whole stuff in terms of you hear about those stories about the interviews and just kind of general things that you're just like, ah, man, I'm trying to deal with a guy that's going to be bringing in a entourage. He has his brother trying to film everything. Like I said, there's a lot of obvious stuff that goes with the whole Sanders family. But those are the legit reasons why he wasn't drafted. But sure as hell ain't racism. And the thing is, it's always so predictable. The same complete fucking morons. And anytime this kind of stuff happens, they want to cry racism. The first one I heard was Stephen A. Smith's reaction in terms of comparing it to Colin Kaepernick and using the word collusion. Like, why the hell would NFL owners collude against drafting a quarterback if the teams thought that he was that caliber of player? They don't care if he's black. They don't care about what kind of bravado he has. You think they're going to not draft a quarterback that can help them win? It's just a ridiculous kind of statement right there to compare it to Colin Kaepernick, which I don't even talk too much about that. That's just such a dumb comparison. But yeah, it's the same people that are always playing the race card in this kind of thing. Ryan Clark, I heard Chad Ochocinco on Nightcap, who was just giving a ridiculous soliloquy about it was something that he was basically kind of reading from the screens, because there ain't no way he was smart enough to think of this on his own in terms of how it's like the whole system about keeping the black man down. Just people kind of cry racism anytime they can, because I guess that just gives them a lot of easy ways out. Maybe it can make Shedeur seem like a victim, which a lot of people in the media obviously have good relationships with Dion, so they want to keep up with him. Hey, you can be friends all you want to, but I just think it's nice when media coverage is, honest and not just playing the easy, lazy race bait card. And I just found a lot of that stuff just to be completely nauseating. New media will jump on that kind of stuff any chance they get to. And instead of being honest with draft analysis in terms of the reasons why the slid happened, they want to go the easy way and play the race card. And that stuff is just, I just find that to be just pathetic. Stephen A. Smith's response, Chad Ochocinco's response, what was another one? Ryan Clark. Like I said, these are the usual people where, you throw anything that might have to do with race, even if it's completely not the reason, they're going to jump on that. So that stuff was just completely pathetic. I won't lie though. Like I said before, it was a kind of weird, odd story. The fact that sliding to day three, the fifth round, it's just crazy that all those mock drafts were just so wrong. And maybe the media bought into the hype. Certainly, if you listen to Mel Kiper Jr.'s coverage during the NFL draft, I mean, this guy was sounding like he was about to cry throughout the whole draft coverage. It was pretty pathetic for day one. And look, I get it. Media's got a job to do. They want to cover the interesting stories, but just every single thing you're hearing is like Shedeur, Shedeur, Shedeur. It's like, how about respecting the actual draft process and talking about the actual, people that are getting drafted? Poor Cam Ward, the number one pick for the Titans, is probably the least talked about number one pick of all time in terms of the NFL draft. Because even while the guy was getting drafted, you had things, and this wasn't Shadeur's fault, but it was the whole thing with the trade between the Jacksonville Jaguars and who was it? The Cleveland Browns. That trade happened right as Cam Ward was being drafted. And speaking of that, that's another reason why the whole racist narrative is just completely stupid. They didn't want to draft him because he was black. I mean, Cam Ward, number one pick, black quarterback, obviously. There's certainly no shortage of black quarterbacks right now. I'm sure any time, and media loves to bring that up anytime making a big deal about black quarterbacks, which certainly isn't a bad thing to have so many, brothers playing quarterback in the NFL. But I think we're really past that in terms of people, really raising an eyebrow to black quarterbacks. Can play whatever position you want to. People are long past that stereotype. But when people see an easy out for things like the whole Shedeur Sanders situation, they'll jump on that whole race bandwagon thing and just make a complete fool of themselves. I'm happy there are people in the media that don't go that easy way out and give honest analysis. I love the takes that Colin Cowherd had about the whole situation, some of the stuff on First Things First. I'm not always agreeing with what those guys have to say, but I think they were kind of spot on in terms of the kind of reasons why the draft played out the way they did. Even people on ESPN, which ESPN is always the crown jewel of race baiting media morons. But even some of the former players, they came out and said, look, a lot of the stuff on the tape and just kind of the whole spectacle behind a celebrity backup quarterback, that's why he dropped in the whole process. So at least you have some things that were on that side, being honest, but plenty of race-based losers making a fool out of themselves. So there you have it with that. So yeah, the Shedeur Sanders situation, I don't think we'll ever see anything like that in terms of draft coverage ever. It was definitely sort of a interesting spectacle to see. The fallout was quite nauseating, hearing from the same losers, say the same kind of racist stuff all the time. But you know what? It was kind of a once an interesting thing to think about, something I just had to put my thoughts about out there because it was a very, very interesting situation to see play out in terms of the draft and the fallout afterwards.